There have been subsequent media reports today that the death toll has risen to 13, 7 Iranian personnel and 6 Syrian citizens. I reiterate the Secretary General's condemnation of the attack. Let me be very clear. The inviolability of diplomatic and consular premises and personnel must be respected in all cases in accordance with international law. The sovereignty and territorial integrity of member states must be respected in accordance with international law. The rules-based international order is essential for international peace and security, which this Council is mandated to maintain. Madam President, Special Envoy Geir Pedersen has kept this Council apprised of the unrelenting violence on the ground in Syria, which features 6 foreign armies operating on its territory, impacting the lives of civilians and moving a peaceful resolution of the conflict farther out of reach. Among them, increasingly lethal attacks on Iran-linked targets in Syria have been attributed to Israel, especially since the current conflict with Hamas in Gaza began on 7th of October. Open sources have reportedly at least a dozen such attacks since the beginning of this year. While Israel has rarely claimed responsibility for any of these incidents, its officials have repeatedly acknowledged its military operations in Syria and have suggested that more such operations will occur in the future. We appeal to the Council today, as we do every month, to continue to actively engage all concerned parties to prevent further escalation and the worsening of tensions that undermine regional peace and security. Madam President, allow me to reiterate the Secretary General's call on all concerned to exercise utmost restraint and avoid further escalation. I also underline his consistent calls on all parties to respect all their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, as applicable, and to avoid attacks that could harm civilian and damage civilian infrastructure. Any miscalculation could lead to broader conflict in an already volatile region, with devastating consequences for civilians who are already seeing unprecedented suffering in Syria, Lebanon, the occupied Palestinian territory, and the broader Middle East. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Khari for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель, мы приняли к сведению.
We have taken note of the factual briefing by Assistant Secretary General Khaled Khari on the latest in a series of Israeli attacks targeting the territory of the Syrian Arab Republic. We believe it is strange that a representative of the Secretariat is using terms such as a rules-based international order, which our Western partners love to use so much, instead of referring to the UN Charter and international law. We thank the Maltese presidency for promptly convening today's emergency meeting of the Security Council under the agenda item Threats to International Peace and Security. We requested it to discuss the incessant missile and bomb attacks by the Israeli Defense Forces targeting various sites in Syria against the backdrop of the unprecedented scale of casualties brought about by the military operation of West Jerusalem in the Gaza Strip, which continues despite the demand of UN Security Council Resolution 2728 for an immediate ceasefire. We are extremely concerned by such blatant disregard by the Israeli authorities with the connivance of the United States for a legally binding decision of the Council. A prime example is Israel's attack on a humanitarian convoy leading a warehouse in central Gaza, coordinated by the NGO World Central Kitchen. Several aid workers were killed in that airstrike. The fact that the actions of the Israeli military caused the deaths of innocent civilians was recognized even by the Prime Minister of Israel. We trust that we will discuss this matter separately at another time. Today, we're here to consider another aspect of Israel's reckless actions. Madam President, yesterday, on April 1st, the Israeli Air Force struck the Consulate of the Islamic Republic of Iran in Damascus. As a result of the attack, the building was leveled to the ground. The office of the ambassador of the Islamic Republic of Iran to Syria was also damaged. Reports indicate that there's a significant number of dead and wounded among his staff. We condemn this attack in the strongest terms. We consider any attacks on diplomatic and consular premises, the inviolability of which is guaranteed by the relevant Vienna Conventions of 1961 and 1963, to be categorically unacceptable. We would like to draw particular attention to the fact that this is not the first attack carried out by Israel in a densely populated area of the capital, Damascus, which has generated high risks of mass casualties among civilians. Since the beginning of the escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli confrontation on October 7, the number of Israeli attacks on Syrian civilian infrastructure and Syria's neighbors has multiplied. Thus, on the night of March 29th, Israeli aircraft launched strikes on various facilities in the vicinity of Aleppo. That attack caused dozens of casualties, with many more injured. Earlier, on March 28th, 2 civilians were injured in an Israeli airstrike in Damascus province. On March 17 and 19, Israeli shelling was directed at the northeastern and southern suburbs of Damascus from the occupied Syrian Golan. In the past few months alone, Israeli aircraft have attacked the international airports in Damascus and Aleppo several times. These airports serve as the main gateway for the entry of United Nations humanitarian aid into Syria. They also struck the areas of Deir ez-Zor and Abu Kemal, where the Syrian military continues its persistent struggle against the remaining militants of terrorist groups, to whom our American colleagues, despite their loud statements, are in fact providing patronage and protection. But we will leave this topic for another Security Council meeting dedicated to the situation in Syria. Madam President, the Russian Federation decisively condemns the ongoing raids on the sovereign territory of Syria and views them as a flagrant violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of that state. We're of the view that such aggressive actions by Israel are designed to further fuel the conflict. They're absolutely unacceptable and must stop. We urge West Jerusalem to abandon the practice of provocative acts of force on the territory of Syria and other neighboring countries, which is fraught with extremely dangerous risks and consequences for the entire region, a region that is already destabilized as the result of the 6-month escalation of violence around Gaza. We call on the international community to unequivocally condemn Israel's reckless actions, which violate the sovereignty of the Syrian Arab Republic and the inviolability of diplomatic property. We consider it necessary for all responsible members of the international community to provide an objective legal assessment of Israel's aggression in the Middle East, which ignores not only the provisions of the UN Charter and relevant resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly, but also the fundamental principles of the Vienna Conventions on diplomatic and consular relations. Colleagues, I am counting on the solidarity of the members of the Council regarding the fact that attacks on diplomatic institutions are unacceptable. After all, if we do not reaffirm this position of solidarity, next time the diplomatic mission of any state could be targeted by an air raid. We trust that each of you today will give a fair assessment to Israel's actions against the Iranian diplomatic mission. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation and pass the floor to the representative of China.
主席女士，
Madam President,
At the outset, I would like to congratulate Malta for assuming the presidency of the Council of this month. The Chinese delegation will fully cooperate with you and your colleagues. I also commend Japan for all your efforts serving as the presidency of the Council last month. Madam President, yesterday, the Iranian diplomatic premises in Damascus, Syria, were hit by an airstrike, causing the death of 7 Iranian personnel and severe damage to the premises. This is a grave violation of the UN Charter and international law, and a breach of the sovereignty of both Syria and Iran. This attack is of an extremely vicious nature. China strongly condemns this attack. 25 years ago, China's embassy in Yugoslavia was bombed by a US-led NATO airstrike, resulting in personnel casualties and damage to the embassy. We feel the grief and pain of the Iranian government and people, and express our deepest sympathy and condolences to the Iranian government and people. In accordance with the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and the universally recognized basic norms governing international relations, the safety and security of diplomatic missions is inviolable. To allow impunity for such reckless acts that lack any baseline would send a seriously wrong signal and would encourage even more risky acts. We take note of the solemn protests and condemnations against Israel raised by Iran, Syria, and other Arab countries. We hope that Israel will respond to them. Madam President, since the Gaza conflict broke out in October last year, we have witnessed attacks on homes, attacks on schools, attacks on hospitals, attacks on humanitarian facilities, attacks on UN agencies, and today, attacks on diplomatic premises. The red line of international law and the basic norms of international relations has been breached time and again, and the moral bottom line of human conscience has been crushed time and again. Such a situation and such a tragedy must stop immediately. Last week, the Council adopted Resolution 2728, calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. We strongly call on the international community to work together to ensure that this resolution is implemented so that the Muslim community will not have to celebrate the month of Ramadan in the midst of gunfire. At present, the ground situation in Gaza is deteriorating with rising spillover risks, and the situation in the Middle East has become ever more precarious. Israel's frequent cross-border strikes against targets in Syria and Lebanon are a serious violation of the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the countries concerned and have aggravated tensions throughout the region. Such provocative actions might trigger greater turmoil and jeopardize the security of the entire region. Such actions must stop immediately. China calls on all parties, especially countries with important influence on Israel, to play a constructive role and to make concrete efforts to bring about an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and to ease tensions and restore peace and stability in the Middle East at an early date. Thank you, President.
Of China, and pass the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente, je tiens tout d'abord à vous féliciter.
Madam President, I would like to congratulate you on acceding to the presidency of the Security Council, and I'd like to thank the delegation of Japan for their actions throughout the month of March. I'd also like to thank Mr. Chiari for his briefing. Strikes yesterday in Damascus have taken place in a context of growing heightened tension in Syria and in the region. Since the Hamas terrorist attack on the 7th of October, Iran and its regional partners have borne a heavy responsibility of this escalation. The civilian population remain on the front line, the frontline victims, and security of states of the region is directly threatened by this escalation. Our collective responsibility is therefore to do everything possible to ease tensions. All actors in the region must show restraint. For its part, France will continue to work to prevent a regional spillover. In coordination with our partners, we are working towards de-escalation in the Security Council and elsewhere wherever necessary. That is the case in Lebanon, where we have warned against any threat of escalation. The parties must urgently work to implement Resolution 1701 to the fullest. In our discussions with parties, we have called for cessation of hostilities. UNIFIL has a crucial role to play in this context, and we commend its activities in these difficult circumstances. Given the very disturbing situation in the Red Sea and in the Gulf of Aden, France recalls its commitment to the freedom of navigation. We firmly condemn destabilizing actions carried out by the Houthis. These actions must stop. France will continue to shoulder its responsibility to ensure security in the Red Sea. Finally, in Syria, France calls for the implementation of Resolution 2254, unanimously adopted by this Council, and we regret the refusal of the Damascus regime to support a credible and inclusive political process. The Syrians continue to pay the price. Madam President, France is working to avoid an escalation in the region, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Yemen, as well as to provide a political and humanitarian response to the crisis in Gaza. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France and pass the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. I extend my congratulations to Malta on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for the month of April. And I want to assure you of Algeria's full support. I would also like to congratulate Japan for the successful presidency during the month of March. I thank Mr. Khaled Khiari for its presentation. First, I want to tell our heartfelt condolences to the people and government of Iran following the deadly airstrike by the Israeli aviation on their diplomatic premises in Damascus yesterday. This attack is a clear violation of international law, particularly the inviolability of diplomatic and consular premises as outlined in the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. Such a grave breach of international obligation by the Israeli occupying power cannot be justified or tolerated. We must raise a strong voice against the dangerous implication of this provocation, which could lead to escalating tensions and wider regional consequences. The timing of these attacks, in the face of international pressure for a ceasefire in Gaza through UN Security Council 2728, indicate a deliberate disregard for the call for cessation of hostilities coming from the whole international communities. The aim of such an act, deliberate act, is obvious: responding to international pressures by escalating the conflict, which prolong the killing of Palestinians for internal political calculation. It is evident that this dangerous act is of nature to draw the entire region into conflict, reflecting a belief of impunity by the Israeli occupying power, which consider itself above international law, akin to a reckless and checked forces. This double standard, where the Israeli power disregard the very laws expecting order to uphold, undermines the very foundation of our international order. This behavior falls short of what we expect from a responsible member of our organization. We have previously emphasized the need to stop the occupying authorities and a violation of its international law. Madam President, the UN Security Council must respond firmly and decisively to this challenge to fundamental principles of state sovereignty, diplomatic sanctity, and respect for territorial integrity. The integrity of our international order hangs on the balance, and there must be repercussion for such flagrant disregard of the law to reinforce our collective commitment to upholding it. The choice is stark. Either uphold the principle of the UN Charter on international law, or risk plunging into chaos and insecurity on a regional spillover. The time for resolute action is upon us. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria and pass the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I also want to thank you, congratulate you on assuming the presidency, to you and to Malta. And I want to thank Japan for leading us through the month of March. I thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari for his briefing. I would like to express our deepest concern over the new developments in the Middle East, including the recent attack on diplomatic premises of the Islamic Republic of Iran in Damascus on April 1st, resulting in several casualties. We condemn the attacks on diplomatic premises are unacceptable and unjustifiable. I would like to make 3 points in that regard. First, Slovenia is profoundly concerned over the escalation and spillover effects across the region. Current devastating situation in Gaza has already had a strong impact on the situation along the Blue Line and in the Red Sea. We continue to see other extremely concerning incidents in the region, including the one in Damascus yesterday. We strongly believe that tensions need to be reduced and the situation needs to be de-escalated. We appeal on all parties to show restraint. We call for the compliance with the Security Council Resolution 2728. A ceasefire in Gaza would ease tensions across the region. Secondly, all UN member states have an obligation to respect and act in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter, and especially its Article 2 on settling international disputes by peaceful means and on refraining from use of force. There is no room for arbitrary interpretations. The same standards apply to all member states of the United Nations. So we call on all to show restraint in the use of proxies, which could further fuel or provoke regional tensions. We are concerned over the escalatory rhetoric by different countries and actors, and we caution that any miscalculation could lead to unimaginable consequences. Thirdly, we call on all parties to respect international law. We remind that all military activities should be carried out in accordance with international law, including international humanitarian law. We underline that all the parties concerned need to fully comply with international law governing diplomatic and consular relations. Mr. President, it should be in no one's interest to have further dangerous escalation in the Middle East. Any of the geographically separated but ultimately intertwined crises could take on a life of their own. People of the region have suffered enough, and this includes people in Palestine, Israel, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, and elsewhere. We should all place their interests first, and this is why it is crucial for this Council to send a clear call for restraint by all, starting with compliance with Resolution 2728 demanding a ceasefire. Slovenia stands ready to engage in a comprehensive response to the crisis. We underline the need for unity of the Council to maintain international law, peace and security. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia and pass the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Comme il s'agit de la première séance publique
As this is the first public meeting of this month, I assure you of Switzerland's full support throughout your presidency, and I thank Japan for its excellent management of our affairs during the month of March. Madam President, we thank Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East, Khaled Kiari, for his briefing detailing yesterday's events in Damascus. Switzerland condemns the airstrike against the Iranian consulate in Damascus, which killed and injured several people. This strike considerably increases the risk of a major end to militia attacks in the region and the implementation of Resolution 2728, demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Switzerland also recalls that Resolution 2254 calls for a national ceasefire in Syria. We call on all parties and those with influence over them to exercise the utmost restraint. All channels of communication must be used to avoid any misunderstandings. A single miscalculation can have disastrous consequences. A further deterioration in the situation must be avoided, and we collectively have the means to prevent it. Any use of force must strictly comply with international law, and international humanitarian law must be respected by all parties. Given the current climate, the proper conduct of diplomatic activity is of the utmost importance. Diplomatic buildings must not be targeted. In such situations, dialogue is essential, particularly to find solutions. This Council and all states must play their full part in facilitating de-escalation. Switzerland is ready to make its contribution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland and pass the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. Korea also joins in other delegations expressing full support to the assumptions of presidency by Malta, and also commends Japanese excellent leadership of presidency last month. I also thank ASG Khaled Kiari for the very useful briefings. Yesterday, we witnessed another escalatory incident that resulted in casualties in Damascus. Last week, to respond to the situation in Gaza, where over 32,000 people have been killed, 70% of whom are reported to be children and women, this Council finally succeeded in adopting Resolution 2728 to realize an immediate ceasefire, release all hostages, and ensure humanitarian access. Nevertheless, and in the absence of implementation of Resolution 2728, seeing another incident in a neighboring country yesterday is very concerning amidst the high tensions. During the course of our discussions regarding the region since October 7th, the Security Council members have shared an understanding that the Gaza situation should not spill over to neighboring areas. Therefore, the incidents in Damascus yesterday is all the more concerning in the context of the larger development in the region related to Gaza. Yet, we also note with concern that incidents such as this have the potential to spill over into Lebanon too. It is also deeply appalling that the attack took place on diplomatic and consular premises. I would like to reiterate that such attacks are contrary to international law and global norms, and that it is imperative for all members to respect diplomatic and consular missions in times of both war and peace. Madam President, history tells us that an unexpected event could expand into irrecoverable tragedies. We are increasingly concerned that additional violent flashpoints could escalate into new tragedies in the region. And it is civilians who suffer the most in such tragedies, as we bear witness to in the Gaza Strip. Reflecting on history, my delegation shares the position of other Council members calling for restraint from all concerned parties and expressing our heightened concern about any possible escalations. Irrevocable calamities in the future can be prevented if the concerned parties show restraint in the present. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea and pass the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Madam President, thank you for convening the meeting. And let me join colleagues in congratulating Malta on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month of April. We also thank and commend Japan on the successful presidency in the month of March. We welcome the presence and participation of the representative of Iran and Syria in this meeting. We also thank ASG Khalid Kiari for the information provided. Sierra Leone at the outset underscores the importance to emphasize the sacrosanct nature of the United Nations Charter and its principles, including the principle enshrined in Article 2, Paragraph 4, which provides that, and I quote, all members shall refrain in their international relation from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations, end of quote. Accordingly, Sierra Leone takes note of the identical letters from Iran and the media report of missile airstrikes attack at an Iranian diplomatic premises in Damascus, which, as reported, resulted in fatalities. This missile attack on a diplomatic premises implicates breaches of the UN Charter on respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of member states, as well as the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and the 1963 Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. Sierra Leone condemns the use of force in violation of the UN Charter, relevant international law, including the development and conduct of friendly relations, diplomatic and consular protections. We also decry conduct in the region that may lead to an escalation or exacerbate tensions in the already volatile situation. The right to life, the protection of civilians and civilian objects, and the protection of diplomatic missions are sacrosanct principles enshrined in international law, and any violation of these principles must be condemned. The targeting of diplomatic missions undermines global peace and security. Fundamental protections, including the inviolability of diplomatic and consular premises, must be upheld to ensure the safety of all diplomats and consular agents and promote peaceful and friendly relations among states. Madam President, in turning to the ongoing hostilities in the conflict in Gaza, in spite of the adoption of Resolution 2728 by the Security Council, which demands an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan in Gaza, leading to a lasting sustainable ceasefire, Sierra Leone expresses deep regret that the resolution is not being respected by the parties to the conflict. It is worth repeating that the parties to the conflict are under obligation to respect the clear demands of the Security Council and an urge to fully implement Resolutions 2712, 2720, and 2728 adopted by this Council since the start of the Gaza conflict. States with influence are once again urged to apply the necessary pressure on the parties to implement these resolutions. We also wish to recall the International Court of Justice indication of provisional measures in its 26 January 2024 order in the application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip, South Africa versus Israel, and the order of 28 March 2024 on the request for the modification of the order of 26 January 2024, indicating provisional measures. The orders of the International Court of Justice, we reiterate, speak to the imperative for an immediate ceasefire respected by all parties, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, the urgent need to expand the flow of humanitarian assistance to, and reinforce the protection of civilians in the entire Gaza Strip. With a lack of due compliance by the parties and full implementation of the Security Council resolution, particularly 2728, we regret to learn of the reports of, and I quote, an Israeli airstrike that killed 7 aid workers from the World Central Kitchen, leading to the charity to suspend delivery on Tuesday of vital food aid in Gaza, end of quote. Regrettably, the tragedy in Gaza seems to have no end or no limit. Civilians, humanitarian workers, journalists have all been tragic victims of the conflict. Without the implementation of the resolutions of the Security Council, we are now at the precipice of putting at risk the credibility and legitimacy of this Council. In closing, Madam President, Sierra Leone urges for restraint and de-escalation to avoid a further deterioration of the situation in Gaza and the Middle East region. We emphasize the importance of implementing all relevant Security Council resolutions, as well as the importance of cooperation to pursue diplomatic means to address all threats to peace and security in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone and pass the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. As today is the first open briefing this month, let me take this opportunity to express our sincere gratitude to all Council members for their kind support during Japan's presidency. We wish Ambassador Vanessa Frazier and her able team of Malta the best of luck for the month of April. Let assure our sincere support as we have received from you. I also would like to thank ASG Hiari for his briefing. Although we have yet to confirm the facts on the ground, Japan is monitoring with deep concern the situation following the reported airstrikes against Iranian diplomatic premises in Damascus that allegedly killed at least 13 people, including Iranian officials. Madam President, we are seriously worried about the current volatile situation in the Middle East, in which any additional conflicts could lead to a wider escalation and confrontation. Therefore, Japan calls upon all relevant parties to exercise maximum restraint and not to engage in any further destabilizing actions. What is now desperately needed is stability. Japan remains committed to making every effort in close cooperation with fellow Council members and other key stakeholders to prevent a further deterioration of the situation, to restore security and stability, and to find sustainable solution to end the crisis in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan and pass the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Let me congratulate Malta on assuming the presidency for the month of April and thank Japan for their successful presidency during the month of March. I also thank ASG Chiari for his briefing on Monday's strike in Damascus. We underline the importance of respect for the inviolability of diplomatic premises and protection of diplomatic and consular staff for the proper conduct of diplomatic relations. The safety and security of diplomatic premises and staff is a fundamental principle guiding diplomatic relations. President, we are clear that Iran's role in destabilizing the region through its military, financial and political support to groups which have been conducting and threatening attacks is unacceptable. Amongst the groups which Iran has continued to support are Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, militias in Syria and Iraq, and the Houthis. As well as attacking Israel, these groups have been responsible for the attacks against international shipping, including the deaths of innocent mariners and attacks against international forces in Iraq and Syria. Our Foreign Secretary has raised repeatedly with his Iranian counterpart the need for this support to cease and for Iran to use its influence over the groups to prevent their attacks. President, The United Kingdom is deeply concerned about the potential for escalation in the region and calls on all parties to reduce tensions. We are committed to de-escalation in the Middle East. We've long been calling for an immediate humanitarian pause in Gaza, leading to a sustainable ceasefire without a return to destruction, fighting, and loss of life, as the fastest way to get hostages out and aid in. This Council sent a clear signal on this just last week when it passed Resolution 2728. We stand ready to work with all members of this Council and the international community to promote and protect international peace and security in the region and throughout the world. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom and pass the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President, and allow me to firstly congratulate Malta on the assumption of the presidency of the Council, and also to thank Japan for the excellent stewardship of the Council last month. Guyana thanks the presidency for convening today's meeting following reports of an incident involving an airstrike against an Iranian diplomatic facility in Damascus, Syria, yesterday. We thank Assistant Secretary General Mr. Khalid Kiari for the update provided and acknowledge the participation of the permanent representatives of Iran and Syria in the meeting. Guyana strongly condemns this attack. We maintain that any attack against a diplomatic facility is unacceptable and contravenes the fundamental safeguards established in international law, including the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes against Internationally Protected Persons, including diplomatic agents. Guyana joins other Council members in also reaffirming the principles of respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, including the prohibition on the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, as enshrined in the United Nations Charter, and calls upon all states to fully comply with these obligations. We further call for a thorough and swift investigation to determine the circumstances of this incident. We also urge due caution and restraint by all parties and impress upon those involved to avoid any further escalation of tensions in the region that could result in even more tragic consequences. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana and pass the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And before I begin, let me congratulate you on assuming the presidency and assure you of my government's full support as you carry out your duties. I'd also like to congratulate Japan for its very successful presidency in March. Assistant Secretary General Chiari, thank you for your briefing. Colleagues, as the White House has stated, the United States had no involvement in the reported strike yesterday in Syria. Neither did we know about it ahead of time. We have communicated this directly to Iran. We cannot confirm any information about this event. As we gather details, one thing is clear. Iran and its proxy and partner groups need to avoid escalating tensions in the region. Indeed, since the October 7 terrorist attack on Israel, the United States has repeatedly warned Iran not to take advantage of the situation to escalate its long-standing proxy war against Israel and other actors. Iran has ignored this warning. Terrorists and other armed groups, some backed by the Syrian regime and Iran, have used Syrian territory to plot and launch attacks on Israel and U.S. facilities and personnel. Along the Blue Line, the Iranian-backed and armed Hezbollah attacks Israel regularly. In the Red Sea, Iranian-backed Houthis have violated international law and repeatedly attacked commercial and merchant vessels. Iranian-backed groups also have attacked U.S. diplomatic facilities in Iraq and attacked U.S. military personnel engaged in the fight against ISIL-Daesh. Iran's hand is evident in the actions of all of these terrorists and proxy and partner groups. We have repeatedly warned the Syrian regime to curb Iran's destabilizing actions on its territory. We also have long-standing concerns regarding the use of Syrian territory to launch attacks on neighboring countries. For example, on March 31, an Israeli fighter jet reportedly intercepted a suspicious aerial target making its way toward Israel from the direction of Syria. And on numerous occasions since October 7, we have seen rockets, armed drones, and other weaponry being launched from Syrian territory toward Israeli positions in and around the Golan Heights. We have taken steps in self-defense to respond to attacks on U.S. military personnel conducting operations against Daesh in Syria and Iraq. We will not hesitate to defend our personnel and repeat our prior warnings to Iran and its proxies not to take advantage of the situation. Again, an attack in which we had no involvement or advanced knowledge to resume their attacks on U.S. personnel. Even as we continue to learn more about this incident, it seems clear that every member of this Council should reiterate that all states, including Iran and Syria, have a responsibility to avoid the path of escalation, to stop arming and advising terrorist groups, and to rein in the actions of proxies who threaten regional peace and security. Madam President, 2 final points. I want to be clear. We do not yet have confirmation of the status of the building that was struck in Damascus. Any confirmed attack on property that was in fact a diplomatic facility would be of concern to the United States. Diplomatic missions and their property, as well as official diplomatic residences, must be protected, even and especially in times of armed conflict. As I noted earlier, we are also concerned by reports that terrorist leaders and elements were allegedly present at this facility and condemn Iran's continued coordination, training, and arming of terrorists and other violent extremists. Colleagues, we are saddened and gravely concerned by reports of an IDF airstrike on the World Central Kitchen convoy. This incident is yet a further reminder that Israel needs to do much more to protect humanitarian personnel and facilities in Gaza. It is unacceptable and inexplicable that nearly 6 months into this conflict, Israeli military deconfliction mechanisms are not functioning appropriately. We join other countries who lost citizens in this incident in calling for a transparent and comprehensive investigation. This must not happen again. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States and pass the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta. Permítame primero saludar la presidencia de Malta durante este mes.
Welcoming the presidency of Malta for this month, and at the same time, I wish you every success and assure you of the support of our delegation. I would also take this opportunity to thank Japan for their extraordinary leadership in the Security Council over the month of March. Madam President, we are grateful for the information provided by ASG Khaled Khiari. Ecuador condemns any attack carried out against diplomatic and consular missions and representatives, as well as any infringement on the security and integrity of missions and representatives of international intergovernmental organizations and the staff of these organizations, and we reject these acts of violence regardless of origin. We echo the statements made by the Secretary-General regarding the attack on the Iranian diplomatic premises. This event not only runs counter to the principles enshrined in international law governing behavior among states, but once again, it has cost the lives of civilians and has destroyed civilian infrastructure. My delegation reiterates its position that nothing justifies these types of attacks, and we reaffirm the obligations that all states, according to international law, must respect the immunity and inviolability of diplomatic and consular offices, as well as abide by the provisions of the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and the 1963 Convention on Consular Relations. Any violation in this regard is a serious incident which endangers lives, causes damage, and negatively impacts the promotion of shared values of the international community. For that reason, Ecuador hopes that these acts will be duly investigated and that those responsible will be tried and brought to justice. Moreover, we reiterate our concern because acts such as this, in the midst of an extremely complex global geopolitical situation, exacerbate tensions and could unleash actions of unpredictable consequences for international peace and security. We therefore continue to call on states to work with maximum restraint. Thank you.
Thank the representative of Ecuador and pass the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you. Madam President, allow me to begin by reiterating our warmest congratulations to you and to your country for assuming the presidency of the Security Council for the month of April. We also wish to assure you our support, our fullest support during your presidency. To Japan, we express our gratitude for the successful presidency of the Security Council during the month of March. We also are grateful to Assistant Secretary General, Mr. Khaled Kiari, for providing insights into this grave matter. Madam President, yesterday's airstrike, which reportedly resulted in significant loss of lives and damage to the consular section of Iran embassy, constitutes a flagrant violation of the UN Charter, international law, and the inviolability of the diplomatic and consular premises enshrined in the Vienna Conventions. These fundamental principles and laws must be respected and observed and upheld by all states, without any exception. Mozambique strongly condemned this unacceptable attack. The incident starkly reminds us of the ongoing conflicts, geopolitical complexity in the Middle East, particularly concerning the Palestine question and the ongoing tensions between Israel and its neighbors. We believe that such actions could potentially escalate regional tensions, trigger further conflicts involving other countries, and could have unimaginable implication for regional and international peace and security. Madam President, in light of this situation, this grave situation, it is imperative that all parties involved, especially Israel, strictly adhere to international legal norms and agreements. Upholding these fundamental principles is essential to prevent further military confrontation and maintain stability. The Security Council must closely monitor the situation and take necessary measures to prevent further escalation of hostilities resulting from this attack. We reiterate our consistent appeal to Council members to redouble efforts toward a sustainable solution to the Middle East conflict in full compliance with relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. We commend ongoing diplomatic efforts by various actors, including certain members of this Council, aimed at re-establishing a path toward peaceful coexistence among neighboring states and peoples in the Middle East. Finally, let us collectively and genuinely work towards a peaceful and stable Middle East region, mindful of legitimate concerns of all parties involved. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique. I will now deliver a statement in my national capacity. Let me begin by thanking ASG Chiari for his remarks today. The Middle East continues to be in a state of turmoil. As we have stated on several occasions, this volatile situation is completely untenable. At a time during which all sides should be focused on diffusing tensions, all we are witnessing are steps in the opposite direction. The airstrikes carried out against the Iranian Consulate in Damascus yesterday evening are just the latest episode of a long string of deeply troubling events. We are worried that this attack takes place against a backdrop of death and destruction in the region. We stress that international law, including international humanitarian law, must be respected at all times. This also includes respect for the inviolability of diplomatic missions and protection of diplomatic staff. This Council has repeatedly heard the warnings that such strikes only exacerbate tensions and increase the risk of regional conflict. Furthermore, they risk worsening the already dire humanitarian situation of the Syrian population. Regrettably, the regional ramifications of the conflict in Gaza continue to be felt. I repeat and emphasize that de-escalation must remain our highest priority. Maximum restraint must be exercised by all actors in the region at this extremely delicate moment. This starts with the implementation of Resolution 2728, which demands an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the release of all hostages. Just like all other Security Council resolutions, this resolution is binding and must be respected. From Damascus to Gaza to the Red Sea to the Blue Line, all our diplomatic expertise and collective leverage must be brought to bear to quell the flames of war before they are fanned out of control. Cool heads must prevail, or the consequences will be catastrophic. Thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we've carefully listened to today's statements from Western colleagues, from the troika of the permanent members of the Security Council, and we were once again struck by their cynicism and their double standards. From their verbal gymnastics today, it is very hard to understand why we gathered here today at all. The representative of France said everything except for a single word of condemnation for yet another violation of international law by Israel. What we're talking about is an intentional strike on a diplomatic premise. Colleagues, what if it was your embassy that were attacked or your consulate in the region? Would you respond in the same way? This is your rules-based order in all its glory. The United States always possess information on any topic firsthand. They're proud to have this information because thanks to their intelligent capabilities, they always are the first to find out about anything. But suddenly, surprisingly, the U.S. still has no confirmation in this case, or no verified data regarding the strike on the consulate of Iran. How puzzling indeed. I do not believe this, as Stanislavski said. The UK and the US not only made hints, but almost directly accused Iran and Syria for the Israeli strikes on the consulate. It's hard to imagine greater cynicism. Do not call others to de-escalation and pin the labels of aggressors on the victims of the attack. In this context, any potential escalation in the situation will be fully on your conscience. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Madam President, at the outset, allow me to congratulate you for assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month. We thank Russia for requesting this urgent meeting, which focuses on the heinous and terrorist attacks committed by the Israeli regime against the diplomatic premises in flagrant violation of international law. We also thank China and other members who supported convening the meeting. We thank Mr. Khaled Khiari, ASG, for his briefing. Madam President, yesterday, we urgently notified the Security Council members of yet another flagrant violation of international law committed by the Israeli regime within Syria territory. As reflected in our letter on 1st April 2024, our diplomatic premises in Damascus came under terrorist attacks carried out by the Israeli regime. 7 missile airstrikes from the occupied Golan Heights specifically and intentionally targeted the diplomatic premises of Iran, including the consular section, building, and the ambassador's residence. Tragically, these heinous attacks resulted in a martyrdom of 7 Iranian personnel, including senior military advisors, and some others were injured. Alongside the complete destruction of the consular building, the embassy's administrative parts also suffered significant damage due to the explosions. The final and accurate death toll remains uncertain, as the entire diplomatic premise, international law, and the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. The crime committed yesterday by the Israeli regime goes beyond mere criminality. It represents a profound affront to the shared principle of the international community, namely the inviolability of representatives and diplomatic and consular premises. This principle is a cornerstone upon which international relations are built, universally recognized and upheld. This crime brutally breaches the fundamental principle of diplomatic and consular immunity and flagrantly violated the 1961 Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the 1963 Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, and the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes Against Internationally Protected Persons, including diplomatic agents of 1973. Madam President, the Security Council has consistently united in unequivocal condemnation of the violent assaults on embassies and consular premises of member states. The Security Council has always reaffirmed that such reprehensible acts, regardless of motive or perpetrator, are unjustifiable. Given the grave repercussions of this reprehensible act, which could escalate tensions in the region and potentially spark further conflict involving other nations, we call on the Security Council to vehemently condemn this unjustified criminal act and terrorist attack. Madam President, it's now crystal clear that Israel's ongoing destabilized and irresponsible actions and atrocities against the nations in our region are a real threat to regional and international peace and security. This regime has consistently demonstrated disregard for international law, the UN Charter, and humanitarian and human rights principles. Israel's agenda is obvious: to escalate and perpetuate the conflict while evading accountability. It did not redline to kill civilians and even used starvation as a method of warfare. Its primary concern is the unlawful use of force to advance its apartheid policies, ethnic cleansing, genocidal acts, and military objectives in Gaza at all costs. Despite repeated calls from Council members, Israel continues in its atrocious and genocidal acts against the defenseless people of Gaza. And despite international pressure and UN Security Council resolutions calling for a ceasefire, Israel has defied these resolutions. Rather, its focus remains on committing more atrocious crimes, showing no regard for international legal obligations. Just today, this regime outraged and killed the World Central Aid workers in Gaza. As the Undersecretary General highlighted, they were the heroes killed while trying to feed starving people. Regrettably, the absence of accountability and the Council's inaction has only encouraged and even emboldened this regime to continue its violation unchecked. It is high time for the Security Council to shoulder its responsibility and address the real threat to international peace and security. The Security Council must promptly fulfill its duty in response to Israel's reckless defiance. Urgent and enforceable measures must be taken to compel this regime to uphold its obligations. Madam President, the Islamic Republic of Iran has exercised considerable restraint, but it is imperative to acknowledge that there are limits to such forbearance. The occupying regime must bear full responsibility for its consequences. Iran reserves its legitimate and inherent right under international law and the United Nations Charter to take a decisive response to such reprehensible acts. Madam President, the representative of the United States and United Kingdom once again tried to deny its responsibility for the current situation in Syria and broad region by falsely blaming Iran. Iran strongly rejects these allegations. Iran is never seeking to contribute to the spillover of the conflict in the region, nor does it to escalate or spread the tension to the entire region. Despite expressing concern over the spillover of the tension in the region, the United States tries to misuse this situation to destabilize Syria and the region. The United States is responsible for all crimes committed by the Israeli regime. The savage and genocide acts in Gaza could not be happened without explicit consent and comprehensive political, financial, and military support, as well as partnership from the United States. Ironically, the United States talks too much about protecting civilians in Gaza and also expresses its concern about the violation of humanitarian law. At the same time, it has blocked the Security Council for over 6 months from taking urgent and appropriate action to stop the war in Gaza. If the U.S. genuinely cares about civilians and upholds humanitarian international law, it should refrain from blaming Iran and instead compel the Israeli regime to implement the UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire. Madam President, about the United Kingdom allegations, instead of deflecting blame onto others, the UK should face up to its mistakes and rectify its detrimental policies that have adversely affected the people of the region. The long-standing suffering of the Palestinian people, persisting for over 7 decades, can be traced back directly to the colonial policies of the United Kingdom. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran and pass the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to congratulate you on presiding over the Security Council during the month of April. I would also like to thank your predecessor, the permanent representative of Japan, and their team for the successful conduct of the Council's business over the past month. My delegation would also like to express thanks to the delegations of the Russian Federation and China for their effort to convene this emergency meeting of the Security Council. Madam President, in yet another episode in a string of Israeli attacks against my country, Syria, at about 5 o'clock Damascus time yesterday, the 1st of April, the Israeli occupation forces, in broad daylight, have launched a barbaric rocket aggression from the direction of the occupied Syrian Golan. It targeted the building of the Consulate of Iran in the Meza neighborhood of the Syrian capital, Damascus. This barbaric aggression led to the destruction of the entire premises and the martyrdom and injury of all those inside, including Syrians and Iranians, in addition to a number of passers-by in that area. The targeted Iranian consulate building is located in a densely populated area. It's full of civilians. It's just a few meters away from the headquarters of foreign diplomatic missions and international organizations, including the World Food Programme. That, in addition to a private hospital, faculties affiliated with Damascus University, and a number of private banks and companies. This vital area is crossed by thousands of civilians on a daily basis, as it is an essential route in the city. Some of those civilians have suffered severe injuries because of this terrorist aggression, which constitutes a dangerous precedent. It is a grave violation of international conventions and norms that guarantee the protection and immunity of diplomatic premises and personnel, and the prohibition of any attacks against them, including the Vienna Conventions on Diplomatic and Consular Relations, and the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Internationally Protected Persons, including diplomatic personnel. Madam President, Over the past few days, these hysterical Israeli attacks have also affected civilian buildings and installations in rural Damascus and a few areas in rural Aleppo and Deir ez-Zor. This resulted in the death and injury of a number of civilians and military personnel, in addition to the material damage to public and private property. This comes in flagrant violation of international law, international humanitarian law, and the principles and purposes of the United Nations. These attacks coincided with attacks launched by terrorist groups and organizations active in northwestern Syria. They used drones against civilians in the city of Aleppo and rural Aleppo. The Israeli attacks also coincided with terrorist attacks carried out by the terrorist organization Daesh in the eastern areas of the country. This reaffirms the existing and ongoing coordination and distribution of roles between the Israeli occupation authorities and their terrorist proxies. Madam President, the Israeli occupation authorities would not have committed this aggression against a protected diplomatic headquarters, protected under international law, or an aggression against any other civilian objects, such as airports, ports, or residential neighborhoods, had it not been for the blind support of the United States. The latter has provided them for decades with an umbrella of sponsorship and impunity. This enabled them to commit the most heinous atrocities, the most recent of which is the genocide and the brutal crimes committed against the Palestinian people for nearly 6 months. Moreover, the U.S. administration rushed to claim that the Resolution 2728 is not binding and does not impose any new commitments. This to absolve Israel from its implementation or implementing the ceasefire. It was a blatant disregard for the bloodshed of more than 33,000 civilian Palestinian. I repeat, 33,000, most of them women and children. This in addition to more than 173 UNRWA officials and dozens of others from humanitarian organizations. We have listened today to the Israeli targeting that killed 7 working in an NGO in Gaza. And this is a matter that the representative of the U.S. failed to condemn. The Israeli aggression also led to the killing of a number of journalists, in addition to the destruction of thousands of residential buildings, places of worship, health and educational facilities, including UN premises. My country, Syria, holds the war criminals of the Israeli occupation government and their partners in the United States administration fully responsible for these attacks and their repercussions on regional and international peace and security. They are also responsible for pushing the region to unprecedented levels of escalation and instability. Syria warns from any continued policy of such attacks. Syria calls on the United Nations to shoulder its primary responsibility in condemning the repeated Israeli attacks. The UN must act immediately to put an end to such attacks, prevent their recurrence, hold their perpetrators accountable, and ensure that they do not go unpunished. Syria stresses that the failure of the Security Council to fulfill its responsibilities due to the obstructive role of the United States undermines the system of collective security on which our organization, the United Nations, was founded. This leads member states to believe that it is useless to rely on the power of international law or international legitimacy to regain our rights. To conclude, Mr. President, the Syrian Arab Republic affirms that these attacks will not deter it from its national choices or its firm positions in support of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and the establishment of their independent state with Jerusalem as its capital. We will also continue our endeavors to recover the occupied Syrian Golan in full up to the line of the 4th of June of 1967. We will liberate all our territory from the illegal military presence and its proxies from terrorist organizations secured by the international law. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. There are no more names inscribed in the list of speakers.